Now, we've talked before about what are the top 5 worst units in the High Elf army. Now, today I want to talk about what are the top 5 best units in the High Elf army. Now, before going into this video, I want to make the huge disclaimer up front. As always, this is my anecdotal experience. You might have a totally different set of top 5 and worst 5 than I do. This top 5 list really pertains majority to the competitive meta, but it also is applicable to the greater campaign as a whole. We will talk about some of those differences as we work our way through this video. The majority of them, though, will be aimed at that kind of competitive meta standpoint. And we'll be going from the number 5 slot to the number 1 slot. My typical top 5s are not in order, but these are in order. This was a pretty painstaking video. I had to really decide what the hell is going to fit what slot, but we'll go into a little bit about what some of the lore connotations are behind each one of these units, the kind of tabletop surrounding and scenarios with these units as well, and then going into the Total War Warhammer 2 facts and numbers about them. So let's jump into this list. The High Elves here are a very defensive style of army. In the tabletop, the High Elves had their special abilities were aimed really at being the defensive powerhouse versus the Dark Elves, which were, well, aimed at being the murderous or offensive powerhouse. And that really kind of shined. When you take a look at the tabletop differences between the High Elves and the Dark Elves did always end up above the High Elves in the tier rankings, because in a game like Warhammer, or even a game like Total War Warhammer, the object is to kill more of the enemy than they kill of you. And honestly, it always came down to murderous prowess, kind of taking the limelight over the High Elves' martial prowess in the tabletop. Now, the way that this is done in Total War Warhammer is a little bit different. So let's jump into our top 5 here, and let's go into each and every unit, starting with one of my favorites, the Spearmen / Lothern Seaguard. Now, the Spearmen are one of the best units in the High Elf roster. I mean, arguably, they are the best Spearmen in the game. Now, from the tabletop standpoint, they were the backbone of the High Elf army, the backbone of the militia of every single one of the portions of Ulthuan, Inner and Outer Realms. And really, when it comes down to these guys, it holds true. These guys have the highest armor of any Spearmen at a whopping 40. In addition, they have a 55% missile resistance with their silver shields. So these guys really are that holding of the line that we see for the High Elves. This silver host of High Elf phalanxes that kind of holds the line against the demons, the Dark Elves, any number of the foes of the High Elves. Now, in addition to that, kind of playing that holding the line mechanic, they also have the highest leadership of any Spearman unit at a whopping 70. Now, there's one thing we should really kind of take a look at and consider with these best units is that there is martial prowess. This does give them 12 melee defense and 2 melee attack. And with that, you get a unit that can really, quote-unquote, hold its ground. Now, of course, you also get a unit that depreciates over time more so than most units. If you look at these guys, this is before the battle has started, but once the battle does start, if I were to press that button up top, you would see the melee attack jump up to 22 and the melee defense jump up to a whopping 50. So these guys are going to attack more or hit slightly more often and get hit slightly less, well, less often, not slightly, because that's a pretty sizable 12. Now, sharing this slot, I couldn't decide. Number 5 was kind of tied for me between these guys and the Lothern Seaguard. Now, with a small reduction in health, as you can see right here, a minus 1046 of the unit health, you get an increase in your melee attack, melee defense, and weapon strength, and the ability to shoot a bow at 165 range, which outranges the majority of base level missile troops. Of course, not considering the High Elves themselves, we'll go with them in a little bit. Now, of course, there's one unit we do have to talk about is the Storm Riders when you're talking about Lothern Seaguard. These guys don't really kind of match the rest of the army as far as its overall cost effectiveness. I honestly never really take the Storm Riders, but they're worth bringing up because they do have fire whilst moving, which is kind of nice, and they also get their Vanguard deployment. But at 900 points, I'll stick with my 500 point Spearmen or my 750 point Lothern Seaguard with shields. Now, my last point on this entry would be the Scions of Mothlan. You cannot make a High Elf build without Spearmen, and majority of the time, Scions of Mothlan also fill that slot as well. With their Guardian passive, which is right there, you get a whopping 12% damage resistance on these guys. So they're an amazing, amazing, amazing backbone to your already backbone army of Spearmen here. So again, you can't have any High Elf army without Spearmen. Our number 4 slot being occupied by the Sword Masters of Hoeth, the Warhammer Worlds Jedis. These guys study for years upon years upon years at the Tower of Hoeth in Safari to really pick up their great sword and become the Sword Masters of Hoeth. But these guys have a pretty big, wide-sweeping connotation in the grander scheme of things. And these are amazing elite infantry, really the best elite infantry of the High Elves. Now, that's not to say that the White Lions or the Phoenix Guard are terrible. I'm just saying that the Swordmasters of Hoeth have a little bit better matchups than the other two. The Phoenix Guards have very specific matchups against, say, Bretonnians or Empire, pretty much cavalry heavy races, and the White Lions are going to crack open things that need low cost, more elite units than just Spearmen. Now, the Swordmasters of Hoeth, again, have a lot better of those kind of matchups as a whole. Now, these guys have the highest melee defense of any great sword unit without their martial prowess right here. Now, this is also the same with their melee attack. Now, this really is awesome here. We've talked about melee attack and melee defense, right? So melee defense, of course, the likelihood of getting hit, melee attack, the likelihood of hitting. The melee attack you can see here is 46 and 36 without the respective bonuses that you would get from martial prowess. When that actually kicks in, you're going to be looking at 48 melee attack and 48 melee defense on deployment. So this allows them to really beat out their dark foe, their dark twins, in the executions of Hargoneth. These guys win against them handedly. Well, not even like a 50-50 shot. Like it's a pretty good balance there. Now, on top of that, these guys can outright kill Chosen without great weapons, that seems like, hey, you know what, that doesn't seem really worth it, because Chosen without great weapons just have shields and sword and axes, and they don't actually have any AP or any anti-infantry. That's my point exactly. They're the same exact cost of 1250, which the Swordmasters of Hoeth cost, and Chosen cost at both 1250. And these guys beat them out even better than they do against the Hargoneth Executioners. Now, when you compare these against the Chosen with great weapons, which you could argue are the very best great weapon variant in the game as far as just general stats go, they actually don't do too terrible against them. They do lose, of course, because that's to be expected, but really at the end of the day, when you're looking at these two units, that unit is 1450 in its total cost. The Swordmasters of Hoeth is 1250, so you get a much higher return per point investment here. In addition to that, Swordmasters of Hoeth are the only great sword, great axe, great weapon variant that actually has missile defense because of their deflect shots. These guys practice for so long in Safari in this Tower of Hoeth that they can actually see arrows coming their way and deflect it with their great swords. Kind of awesome here, right? So it gives them a bronze shield, which of course only gives them a 20% chance to block small arms, but that's better than the rest of the other great weapon variants. You have to just take that right to the face. Now, of course, I wish that these guys had a Regiment Renown version of them that maybe did, like, I don't know, like magic attacks or something like that, or maybe even gave them bound spells, but I still think that the Swordmasters of Hoeth are some of the strongest great weapons in the entire game, if not some of the strongest infantry in the High Elf roster. Occupying our number 3 slot is the Dragon Princes. Now, these are some of my favorite units in the entire game. They're my favorite units in tabletop, in lore. I mean, they're so badass looking. Their aesthetic is amazing. So the Swordmasters of Hoeth are really the elite of the elite when it comes to the actual Total War Warhammer 2 performing infantry and high elves. You can easily say that the Dragon Princes are the kings of shock cavalry for the high elves. Now, what makes them different from not just simply the other cavalry units, but from the high elves as a whole, is their access to martial mastery. Now, of course, as always, these melee attack and melee defense does not have martial mastery affixed to it. As soon as we press start battle, that will be applied. But getting +8 melee attack and +12 melee defense is huge. Martial mastery gives us an additional 6 melee attack that you really can see is going to come out pretty huge here. It's going to give you 44 total melee attack and 42 total melee defense. And really, these guys are just the masters of that shock cav. So if the Spearman's role primarily is to anchor a front line and keep it from falling apart, then the Dragon Prince's role is really as a hammer and anvil. They come in down on the hammer that the anvil that is created by these Spearmen. And these guys do an excellent job at that. They have a pretty substantial speed too. I mean, at 78, they have great leadership, a whopping 110 armor with a great 70% resist to fire. Now that resist to fire isn't substantially huge because not everything in the game does fire damage, but the things that do fire damage, it's going to resist them pretty handedly. So if you take these against Swords of Chaos, the Dragon Princes, not even to mention the Fireborn, will just dumpster them and eat them outright. Now, if you take a look at these, even against Altdorf Gryphites, the Altdorf Gryphites do a significant amount of damage and will kill out a unit of Fireborn. They won't come out of it unwounded, that's for sure, but it's still, that's something to note here. The Dragon Princes aren't meant for high upscale or high tier cav on cav play. Charging in Dragon Princes into Royal Altdorf Gryphites or any unit of Blood Knights, anything that's got anti-large is going to do a lot of damage to the Dragon Princes. They don't have a significant amount of AP and they don't have a significant amount of anti-large here. If we actually take a look here, we can see for a fact they've got 44 weapon strength with only 12 of it being dedicated to AP. So really what these guys are going to be doing is smashing through their flanks, smashing through the rear of any one of your opponents. You can actually even have these Dragon Princes charge headlong into the majority of infantry units in the game and win outright. The biggest thing here is the Dragon Princes with their martial mastery. It allows them to slog through a war of attrition better than almost any other comparative cavalry unit in the game. And as a result, these guys really do earn their number 3 spot because, I mean, every time I take them, they always shine and they can really pull out a lot of value for their point worth of 1400. It's really taking a look at that comparison of a 1400 point unit versus another 1400 point unit. These guys are a little bit more diverse and get a little bit more well-rounded use than other ones of their kind of equal point cost. Our number 2 slot going to the High Elf Archers. Now remember that the normal version of the Archers with light armor was on our top 5 worst. Well, the top 5 best units is definitely going to have these Archer units. They are some of the best Archers in the game outright. And on top of it, you use these considerably in tabletop. They're a great anchor to your force. Now, the nice thing here about the Archers is that of any other tier 1 Archer unit, they have the best range. At 180, the next thing to approach that level of range is a Deepwood Scout at a 180, and they have, I believe it's a 875 or 900 total point cost. After that, it's Waystalkers who have 190. These archers are even better than the typical tier 1 Wood Elf archer unit, have a range of 170. Now, that is substantial because they don't lose out on a ton of other benefits. They still have a 20 missile damage, which is comparative to almost every other tier 1 archer in the game. So these guys can outrange pretty much any other archer unit and trade effectively before they even get a range to shoot back at them, making the light armor variant pretty obsolete. Now, when you get an archer on archer duels, there is a lot to consider there, but these guys do so much damage and such a huge actual amount of damage because they have 68 in their unit on large, so you can actually do a considerable amount. 2 or 3 or 4 of these things in your army, 2 to 4 of these things in your army can delete the majority of a front line before it or one unit in the front line before it gets to you by kind of focus firing. Especially if you use this on any kind of flyer, anything like that. These archer units are so terrifying. It does make for the grand weakness of the High Elves, which is their backline, but defending these guys with Spearmen or any kind of other unit really makes for the High Elves' ability to deal a ton of range damage and at the same time use this in conjunction with the lore of high magic to either boost their reload skill. You can use the Handmaiden of Everlorn to help you boost the reload skill of these guys as well. You can use so many different functions, even using Tempest to lock something down so you can use your archers to focus on it, or Net of Amantak. There's so many great ways to synergize with the archers' already amazing ability to deal out tons and tons of damage. Our number 1 and best slot goes to the Illyrian Reavers. These guys are the consummate fast cavalry, and from a lore perspective, they have this amazing rich history. Honestly, they're kind of like the Riders of Rohan of the Warhammer world. I've already compared the Swordmasters of Hoeth to Jedi, so I guess I'm kind of stuck on that rampage of cross-universe comparisons. But, I mean, these guys are such amazing horse riders that the Dark Riders from the Dark Elves sneak into Illyrian and to steal these horses and turn them into these dark, twisted versions of us. And really, these guys, they live up to their name. Honestly, they have the best cost effectiveness of really any fast cav in the entire game. And martial prowess right here, as we know, their plus 12 melee defense and plus 2 melee attack allows them to really win any 1v1 against any kind of fast cav unit, any kind of beastman, or I'm sorry, not beastman, warhound unit. It gives them a whopping 34 melee defense and 32 melee attack, which is really great for the cost effectiveness of this unit. 600 melee, or sorry, I'm sorry, 600 point cost for just the standard Illyrian Reaver, and 750 cost for the archers themselves. You get access to these guys extremely early in the game, and they're useful all the way until mid to late game for the campaign in and of itself. The biggest kind of downfall with these guys is that you do suffer from the auto-resolve really kind of kicking the ass of the Illyrian Reavers, so that's something to consider here. But I'm gonna back up a little bit so we stop getting that motion sickness going. But on top of that, these guys just have such great utility and well-roundedness that they can really kind of, you can see a use for these guys over most other fast cav in the game. And on top of it, the Reaver Archers, there we go, are some of the fastest fast cav units in the game. You've got Glade Riders and all the Hounds being slightly faster at 94 and 95 respectively, but these guys are extremely fast. And at 140 range, they actually get to a pretty close range of most other range units in the game as far as their entry level. Most things have around anywhere from 140 to 165 depending on what the unit is, with High Elves having the top at 180 and Wood Elves at 170. But these guys can get in range of most other range units pretty easily to kind of snipe out any of the rusty errors or anything like that you would help deal with those Reaver Archers. In addition, they can get really quick, easy, early picks with that 140 range. Now, you really can't talk about these guys, though, without, of course, going into the Heralds of the Wind. These guys are so cool looking. There we go. Now, the Heralds of the Wind are the Regiment of Renown version of the Illyrian Reaver Archers. You can see they have a little bit more gold, brass, and blue and red motifs going on here. But in addition to that, they have a speed of 105. This makes them the fastest unit in the game that runs on the ground. Of course, all the flying units still don't have the fastest speed. I mean, you're looking at Great Eagles and Phoenixes topping out around 110, 140, depending on what kind of lore they're using, lore beasts and such. So the Heralds of the Wind are some of the fastest units in the game. Definitely the fastest on the ground, at least. So you can use these guys to fire whilst moving, just like you can, of course, their Illyrian Reaver Archer counterparts. There's no High Elf build that I take that doesn't have at least one unit of Reaver or Reaver Archers. And I'm putting these guys together because they both share the same kind of utility here. Of course, the difference being that Reaver Archers get a great range attack with, I mean, still 20 missile damage and 140 range. These guys can take out any kind of Dark Riders that they're going to be up against, any kind of comparable fast cav. These guys really win, especially with that martial prowess. Now, there's one thing to kind of mention with all these high elf units is that with martial prowess and martial mastery, it does create a kind of a depreciating value with a unit that as soon as it reaches 50%, they kind of lose some of their worth. That is something to consider with these units. They're not the end all be all, of course. And the high elves, of course, do have very hard counters. So you do have to look at those things when you are choosing what units you're going to bring into every single build you play in the competitive multiplayer realm. But that really sums up our top 5 list here, guys. We've gone through the Reaver Archers and Reavers all the way down to the Swordmasters of Hoeth and the Spearmen and Lothern Seaguard of the High Elves. And really, you can't go wrong with a lot of these units. Even the top 5 worst video that we've talked about, those units still have very niche and specific picks. So you might look at this and go, this is no way for me to build a Lizardman or a Lizardman Blist. That's absolutely true. Each and every one of these picks is going to be very dependent upon what enemies you're playing. And when it comes to campaign, you can have so many more Dragon Princes than you can in competitive multiplayer that allows you to really use Dragon Princes to almost an overpowered abusive stance. Or you can use Silver Helms in their stead to have an all-cav list with Reaver Archers and Reavers, Silver Helms and Dragon Princes. So really look at these top lists as a kind of barometer, as the tops and bottoms of standalone units on their own without really taking a look at their comparison to relative matchups. You do have to take that stuff into consideration. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video here as a kind of way to get you a really good idea on some of the total, I guess, cost effectiveness and overall value of the High Elf roster versus the ineffectiveness of some of the other units if you compare this to the top 5 worst High Elf units. But if you'd like to see more of these videos, guys, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. I'm more than happy to do more of these. Please feel free to check out my Patreon. All of you patrons who have been subscribing here are huge help. You can see them in the credits section after this, so that kind of scrolls through as always. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.